25 years of texts were circulating before you ever saw a doctor enter the arena. And then they started arguing about who had the right, the same sort of things we argue about now.
I wanted to ask, I read this great book by a historian, Keith Thomas, called, he had one book, Religion and the Decline of Magic, and another, Man in the Natural World, where he writes about early modern times and country people, and there are several chapters devoted to folk remedies, where the vernacular terms for various plants, you know, sally root and things that we wouldn't recognize now as technical terms, were used as medicines for centuries.
Oh, Lord, that's what all of these are. When I talk about remedies, they're all natural, herbal sorts of things. While Paracelsianism, which is more chemical, started to rise about 1540, I don't really look at that because that falls under a different tradition. And those texts were not printed and they were not widely circulated. Most of that knowledge was kept confined to learned societies, and so it didn't interest me quite as much. But yes, most of the remedies are based on, you'll see a long list of herbs that you're supposed to have on hand to be able to do lots of things.
But the knowledge that regular people without formal education had of all those flowers and weeds and plants that you just see, you know, growing out in the fields and the forests was very impressive.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's amazing.
Well, looking at the kinds of things that are interesting you, maybe this is a false dualism, perhaps that's the question. Some of it seems like the early modern version of what we've come to know now. So some of, I mean, you know, so chew willow bark, and now we know that's salicylic acid, and you know, leeches have come back again in force, and so it's, in some ways it's not, how shall I say it, it seems as if it's got the same vision of the human body and health that we do. It's just that they didn't go to the store to buy aspirin. They knew they had herbal sources for it. But then there are other aspects of this that seem to really deal with a whole other view of the body, a view of the body that either hasn't come back yet or may never come back. I mean, you know, things like the best days for bloodletting. I'm trying to think if we have any, you know, anything like that. It doesn't feel to me that we do.
No, the closest that we come to it are the small sect of folks who still look at astrology and watch very closely how the calendar can affect other things. They did have a very different view of the body. They accepted many things because they didn't understand it. It's kind of like a black box syndrome. You just expect that it's going to work this way. But they did have a really intimate and impressive sense of knowing what they put into their body and how it would affect, which is something that we don't have as much. Unless you've been really ill in modern times, you don't really know your body as well as I think the early moderns did, because they had to. Yes, ma'am.
Just a short point. I would argue that our equivalent of bloodletting is the pill. That that women who are just put on the pill as a matter of putting a woman on the pill will cure her of all ills. It'll regulate, as long as she has that 30-day cycle. You know, and of course now they are just discovering the host of problems that they have. Or the new host of problems that they have caused as a result of doing it.
And, you know, there are two historians who do a lot of work on women's medicine from that era, Monica Green and Mary Fussell, and they both hinted at that particularly menstruation was a huge thing and it meant a lot of different things culturally. And so that's interesting. It's an excellent point. Mary Beth.
Two questions. One is, there are going to be a lot of gaps, but given the work that's being done in the recovery of the Islam text and that kinds of thing, is there kind of a ability to trace the traditions, because you said there's a lot of repetition.
And overlap,
Right,
yes.
and seeing from the Greek to the Islam to the whatever, and then from the Roman to the European to the whatever. Is there some of that tracing going on?
There's not as much as there could be. I can tell you how many times Avicenna, who was one of the big, huge names in the medical traditions, I can tell you how many times he cited.
Well, it still gives you.
Yeah, and I can also tell you that in the National Library of Medicine in Washington, or in Bethesda, Maryland, any person in this room can go and view one of the largest collections of Islamic medical manuscripts in the world. They're not, people aren't really looking at them, and I don't know why.
There's sort of a second part to that. I was real curious when you said the one fellow wrote, they're wrong, I'm right, essentially. And it's kind of interesting that that's a fairly new concept for somebody to pop in there and say, you know, these guys are all wrong and I'm the right person. Where does that authorizing come from? And is it, do you see shifts in, for example, is it primarily experience or primarily particular types of sources that authorize the material? And do people say periodically throughout the whole thing, they're wrong and right?
It was an interesting mix of both self-authorization as well as citation. So you'll see references to other people, contemporary, or to the classics like Galen and Hippocrates and Avicenna and Dioscorides and several others. And so they authorized that way. The interesting thing is he wasn't the first person to come out and say these other folks are wrong, but he was the first person who did it consistently. Many of the manuscripts, you'll see notations, they'll be marked through in big black or big X'd, or they'll have notations out to the side, this doesn't work, or they'll have notations out to the side that said, I switched, and it tells you how they changed it. And so it's this constant through experience. I think that's the big key from vernacular medicine and that sort of knowledge. It is authorized through experience more so than the more traditional scientific, let's test it out and make sure that it works. They just tried it, and if it didn't work, they tried something.
A little like a disease discussion.
Yeah, yeah, very similar to that. So again, there are many commonalities all through the years through all. Antoinette?
Yeah, I was just struck by many of your comments there because as I was telling you before your talk, my grandmother, who was both a nurse, but she was also an herbalist, and because of my grandparents' late marriage, they both lived in the 19th century. And died when I was born, but so they spanned to that era in England, and still to this day, like you had one of your remedies up there, which I thought was quite remarkable. I thought, I'd have some commonality with your grandmother, which I did, the whiskey and so on.
Yeah.
But the one that really struck me was you had one of your tables, and it was for yellow jaundice. That remedy, the one where they're talking about the bark and everything, is one that my grandmother used, and in fact people from all over the village where my grandparents lived in Ireland came to be cured. If you had yellow jaundice, you came to see Mrs. Larkin. You didn't go to the doctor, you went to Mrs. Larkin, and she cured you of various things. But that particular one of those remedies on your thing I was totally wow. And it still continues today. I mean, they do this now.
And women were a lot of the primary caregivers, and they would have storehouses within the kitchen. So Lady Grace Mildmay, who lived in the latter part of the 16th century, she was well known in her community for being the person that you would go to dispense care. And going to John's comment about, or was it Russell, about specializations, there were a lot of specializations in the early modern era. And so physicians were at the top, and then surgeons back then were at the very bottom. Midwives even outranked them.
Yeah.
And the local person, like a Lady Grace Mildmay or like your grandmother, would have had much more stature within the community for the knowledge that they had and could share.
Yeah, and it is quite amazing. It was quite fascinating listening to your stuff because I know my grandmother, no matter whenever I go there, she's never referred to by her first name. Anyone who knew her, it's always this title of Mrs. But it was that was the higher than the doctor. That was quite fascinating.
Did you get yourself connected with this material with the concept of the magic, the witchcraft, the change, and all that kind of stuff? Is there much of the magic sense in the work?
Very little. It kind of disappeared by print. although you'll see things. So one of the remedies I track, because it's just interesting to me, is the bite of a mad dog.